stories don't define you. How you tell them will. Hi, I'm Sarah Elkins, your host and chief story maker of Elkins Consulting. We share stories for many reasons, to persuade, to entertain, to connect. What we sometimes forget is the impact of the stories we tell ourselves. Whether you're sharing personal stories or business stories, how you share them makes a difference in how you remember them and in how you're perceived by the people you're interacting with. When you figure out which stories to share, difficult bosses and coworkers, successes, failures, the next step is to develop how you share them. Have you figured out your patterns, your roles in those successes, the discomfort and your challenges? In this series, you'll hear stories that will resonate with you. You'll nod your head in understanding, and then we'll dig into the lessons from each of those. How many times have you been sharing a story only to be interrupted by a person eager to share his own? When I'm working with clients on communication skills, I remind them to listen for understanding, not to respond. But during this podcast, I'm asking you to listen and consider your own related stories, to listen and consider which stories in your life might have impacted you in a similar way. I have the opportunity to have a chat with Oleg Lougheed, and I was introduced to him by Shelley Brown, who spoke so highly of him in his event, and she told me that we should definitely meet because our theories and themes around storytelling are so complementary. So, Oleg, thank you so much for joining me today on Your Stories Don't Define You, How You Tell Them Will.
Thank you so much. Thank you for having me on. I'm extremely grateful for people like you who have built these wonderful and courageous platforms for people to be themselves. I think that's one of the biggest elements that I've learned throughout my own human experience that I've always been seeking is the desire to connect, belong, be supported. And I admire you for what you've done because this platform, from the brief encounter that I've already had to who you are, I firmly believe that it serves all three of those.
Thank you. Yes, I believe that. When I started it, it was kind of a random thing that I wanted to try. It was because I wanted to have an experience that I could share then with my no longer virtual conference participants when we did that 2 years ago. And here I am pushing up to my 100th episode as a result of some random decision to start a podcast. And
that's amazing.
It's been a really great adventure. I'm super happy with it. So the first question I always ask my guests is that I ask my guests to share something about themselves that most people probably don't know about them. And I know that you share a lot of your personal story, so this might be a little harder for you, but I really like for our listeners to have kind of some context around who you are before we get into those personal stories that we'll end up sharing later in the podcast.
Absolutely. I think it's a wonderful question that you ask. And the way that I would like to answer that question is, for me, this whole experience of life, it has been composed of similar questions like that. And so I've always been putting myself along this journey where I'm asking myself questions that I genuinely want to know answers to. And so as part of that experience, it has led me on a series of rabbit hole trails sometimes where I find myself in a position where I thought I had known what I did. And then all of a sudden it's like, boom, all of a sudden you know nothing. So it speaks highly of what is life, right? At the end of the day. But I think the way that I would like to introduce myself for yourself and a lot of the listeners that are listening to this show is I was born in a foreign country. And the city that I was born in is called Chibarkul. And the story behind there is that I didn't have the traditional upbringing that I think most people are exposed to from a very young age. And so as part of that journey, there were many circumstances of tragedy and I guess you could say rather unfortunate events that I had to experience. But with the knowledge and the mindset that I have now and the perspective ultimately that I've been able to develop through this understanding, I firmly believe that all of the decisions, all of the events had to happen the way they have in order for me to understand life from this point of view. And so as part of that journey, what I began to understand is that life is not necessarily about bad or right decisions. It's simply decisions, and that's what they are. When
Mhm.
you think about, when I think about who I am at my core, I'm a combination of all of the decisions that I've made. And so for me, as far as this little fact about who I am, is I choose to embrace myself for that individual. And I choose to love myself for that being and know that I am who I am. And there's nothing that I can do to change that.
And you think that that's something that most people don't know about you?
I don't know if it's, well, it depends. Most people, right? Who are the most people? Is it most people within my tribe? Is it most people within the world? It all depends, I think, how you define that particular question. I think most people within my tribe do know me for who I am, but outside of it, I think most people do not know me and do not know my character that I've
Mm-hmm.
developed through this journey. Um, I think that's the best way that I could answer that particular question
Mm-hmm.
in trying to understand who are the most people.
Right.
Mm-hmm.
Well, and that's definitely not something that I would find in such detail on your LinkedIn profile or on a resume. So
Mm-hmm.
that does definitely answer the question. Um, that's interesting. And I like that perspective because I think a lot about that when I think in terms of things that happen in our lives and how
Mm-hmm.
they shape us. And when my younger son was taking a psychology class in high school, he interviewed me and he asked me if I had regrets. What do I regret about my life?
Mm-hmm.
And I really couldn't come up with anything specific. I couldn't say that I regretted anything specifically because every decision I made, no matter how questionable or
Mm-hmm.
potentially damaging, led me to where I am right now. So I really understand what you're saying here
Mm-hmm.
in that those things that happen and the decisions that we made in the past shape who we are today. And so regret really doesn't have a place there.
Mm-hmm. And
But what does, go ahead.
as part of regret, what it makes me think of is I myself at many moments of my life was asked a similar question because of my past. And
Mhm.
just like I said, it's not the traditional past that I think most people experience. And so as part of that journey, people have asked me, well, what do you regret about it? You know, do you regret going into the orphanage at an age? Do you regret giving up your parents' rights at 9 years old? Do you regret being adopted into a family halfway across the world, not knowing the language or anything and transitioning into this new world? And the way that I choose to answer that question now is that I don't regret any of it. And the reason why I don't regret it is because I think regret, for based on my experience, it comes from a point where there hasn't been a level of acceptance that happened.
Mhm.
And so regret for me is an interesting topic to explore because the more I've been able to accept elements of my past and who I am, the less I regret. And it helped me really redefine, well, why regret things, but rather just work through them. You know,
Mhm.
find ways to accept those elements, find ways to accept the imperfections of who we are.
Mhm.
Because I think regret, it whenever I used to think of that particular question, it would put me in a state of being as if I was quote unquote perfect human being with no flaws or anything. But I did the best that I could with what I
Mhm.
knew. And so
Mhm.
if I choose to go back now and say, well, I regret those moments, then who's to say that I would even be in this particular moment had it
Mhm.
not been for those things?
Well, and what I'm hearing from your stories isn't so much about regret, but about bitterness, which
Mm-hmm.
I think of as two pretty different things. I can't imagine that you can regret things that you didn't have any control over.
Mm-hmm.
But you could certainly be bitter or angry about those things that happened that you didn't have any control over. And what I'm hearing you say is that there is no place for that either
Mm-hmm.
because you can't change it, because you can't go back,
Right.
but also because if you use those experiences to make yourself a better person, to help other people, to contribute, to the discussion about how to make things better for other people,
Mm-hmm.
then there's no place for bitterness and anger. It's just part of who you are.
Yeah.
I like that. That's cool. So you talked about moving across the world, basically being adopted into a family in the US. Do you have a vivid memory of that experience, of that pivot point in your life?
I do. I actually have a vivid memory of, I want to say, most of the things that have happened to me from maybe 4 to even 5 years old and moving forward. And so that memory that you're asking about of me coming to the States at the age of 12, it was a rather difficult transition for many different reasons, as you can imagine. One of those is coming into a country and not knowing the language. One of the things that happens to a 12-year-old, in my particular case, when you move to a foreign country and you don't know how to speak their language, is it becomes very difficult for you to communicate. So what I noticed myself doing was falling back on a lot of these methods that at the time I didn't even know were methods of communication.
Mm-hmm.
One of those was at school. I have this story that I stepped on a soccer field and a bunch of my fellow classmates were playing on the field. They were all playing soccer. And in my head, I remember telling myself, pass, pass. That's the universal sign to receive a pass, and then you'd be able to distribute the ball after that. But I kept questioning whether or not the word in my head is going to be the right translation in the English language. And so because of that self-doubt that I didn't fully understand whether or not it's the same exact meaning, that ultimately I didn't say anything. And as part of it, what I think stood out was the fact that I was there, I was present on the field, and one of the kids had acknowledged me and he kicked me the ball. And that was my first instance. That was one of my first interactions within school that I can recall. I remember moments of spending time with my teacher before and after class. He was my 6th grade teacher. Really went above and beyond when it came to everything. Gave it his heart, gave it his all. And so I admire him for that. And I'm extremely grateful for him for all the things that he's done. But even him and I, at first, we couldn't really communicate. So the only way that we did communicate was through math. He would give me math packets, and every day I would go in my corner and I would solve them, come back, and he would pull out a red pen. And I guess red is a universal language for when things are not correct to a certain standard. So he would mark it off, and I just understood that, okay, when the answer is crossed off, it probably means that it's not the correct one. So go back to the drawing board and figure it out. So it's interesting for me to look back at all of these different instances and even the times how I communicated with my parents. I remember going into that household, and most of the things for the first, I don't know, however long, couple weeks to a month, everything was labeled. There were sticky notes everywhere. So imagine walking into a house and all you see are sticky notes: mirror, wall, window, door, refrigerator, all in English, all helping me transition into this new culture. So I think when I used to think of this, there's this only one language, right? English. There were really subcategories of it. I mean, there was a unique language that I had to adapt to.
Oh, that's a love language right there.
Exactly.
Your adoptive family putting those sticky notes on everything so that you could more easily learn the language. That is brilliant and kind. And oh my gosh, I just got a chill hearing that that's how they helped you.
And I think that language was at the core of all 3 of those instances. It's people loving in each other for just being human beings and wanting to care for another, wanting to help another person in some way, shape, or form. So my teacher did that, the kids on the soccer field, my parents. And the more I look at it now, and thank you for helping me recognize that, I think the connecting piece and the principle among the 3 of us was love, was support, was care. And I think that's what ultimately helped me transition into this new world of mine that I ultimately was trying to create for myself.
Mhm. So I'm imagining you on the soccer field and wanting to yell out, pass, pass, but being so self-conscious of not knowing whether that was the right word. And this,
Hmm.
a 12-year-old, I mean, I can't even imagine the discomfort and the self-consciousness of a 12-year-old in that situation.
Hmm.
But I'm just imagining you standing on that field and being frustrated with yourself, but also just kind of desperate to be part of that because it's a language. Soccer is a language that you speak that's common to
Exactly.
these kids on the field. And the kid passes to you without you having to say a word because you
Uh-huh.
do have that international language of gestures and
Uh-huh.
physicality on a soccer field. And what happened after? So he passed you the ball. Do you have, is it vivid as far as what happened after that?
After that, I don't remember it. And the reason why is I think for me, there are a couple of moments in my life where I can recall all of the decisions and everything leading up to that quote unquote big event. That event for me was a big event, an event where I went into the courtroom in Russia with my adoptive parents to tell the judge that yes, I do accept Oleg Michael Polyner Lougheed as my new legal name. And then after that, boom, just there's just no memory of it. And I don't know why that happens. I don't know why that happened to me as far as that particular instance. I'd like to think that it's because I had reached a level of excitement where I truly was in a whole other realm of this
Mhm.
existence. I don't know if
Well,
that
it
makes
became,
sense.
yeah, what I'm imagining is you see this smile on this kid's face when you
Hmm.
catch the pass. And you probably remember this kid and what he looked like. You probably have kind of
Yeah.
a weird,
Hmm.
yeah, a vivid, for some reason, strange memory of this kid that you may never have seen again. Who knows if you became friends or what.
Hmm.
But what I'm imagining is that you had this sudden, complete level of comfort.
Yeah.
And that's why the memory slips out at that point, is because you became natural. It
Yeah.
became the next step, as opposed to the unnatural step of standing there waiting for something to happen.
Yes. And being concerned with your surroundings, being concerned
Mhm.
with the fact of whether or not you belong there. And, being concerned with the fact that are people there truly to support me? Can I trust them?
Mhm.
I
Oh,
think that's one of the
trust is a
biggest
big one.
things that I've learned throughout this existence is that due to my early upbringing, one of the factors that was always in question was trust.
Mhm.
And so, as part of that journey, I, whether intentionally or unintentionally, it's hard to say, had developed almost a secondary checklist of things that an
Mhm.
individual has to go through in order for me to trust them. So in order
Yeah.
for me to open up to you to a certain level, there's like an internal checklist that you go through. Does the
Mhm.
body language align? Is there judgment? Is there comparison? Is there space where the other person is sharing information that is of equivalent to the type of vulnerability that I'm presenting? So,
Mhm.
as part of that journey, I think there was an internal checklist that was created on that soccer field. But when I had received that ball, and I also think touch is extremely important. So when I was able to touch and feel and be able to almost absorb that energy that was being literally passed to me and through me,
Mhm. Mhm.
that's, I think, I was able to kind of step into my own element of who I am and get away from all of the barriers and the walls that I had created, and then just be at one within that particular space in that community.
There's so much beauty in that story right there,
Hmm.
in terms of application and how we can do that with other people. If we see that without having to speak the same language, um, if if we behave like that boy on the soccer field,
Hmm.
like both boys on the soccer field. I mean, you put yourself into that position and you could have been dismissed at that moment. You would have put yourself out there vulnerable, standing on the soccer field, making that motion to please pass to me, and
Yeah.
then be dismissed and ignored. So that took courage right there. And you probably
Hmm.
didn't even think of it that way at the time.
Hmm.
But the kid facing you clearly saw what courage it took for you to stand on the soccer field without being able to speak that language.
Mm-hmm.
And his welcoming gesture of passing that ball to you. I'm imagining how we can all do that in our everyday lives, even at the grocery store or at the
Yeah.
bank or walking down the street, being able to see the language that somebody's speaking to us and have a gesture that demonstrates that openness and kindness and the ability to connect.
Well, you know what I've learned, and it's very interesting that you point that out as far as the language that we all speak. I firmly believe that there is a universal language that connects us all. And whether or not we're able to pinpoint exactly what that language is, that's a whole different story. But I think as part of it, I'm on the same exact page as you're saying as far as how do we create those elements when we go into a grocery store or whether we're at a Starbucks where you're literally there for, I don't know, 2 or 3 minutes and then you got to get out and move on with your day. It's how do we create that? And what I've learned is that for me, one of the ways that I've been able to recreate that language from that soccer field into other situations, and even prior to that soccer field for the first 12 years, is really putting myself in the shoes of other people and putting myself in instances where I'm beginning to understand that we're all fighting our own battles on a daily basis at any given moment. They could be happy, they could be sad. It varies. And so whenever I've been able to understand that and really almost see a reflection of myself through the other individual and tell myself that, yes, I may not have been there in the same exact shoes, but I can relate. You know, what is that common principle that connects us? When we think of stories that allow us to, I think, connect to one another, it's not necessarily, in my opinion, about the exact events or circumstances that we go through, but what is that underlying principle? Is it loss? Is it love? Is it care? Is it empathy? And so when I've been able to break it down to that, that's when I have a point of connection. And that's where I can tell you, yes, I have not walked the same journey as you have, but I can relate. And here's my story. And I think that's the beauty of even platforms like yours to begin with, is it allows people to connect through our own stories.
Mm-hmm.
And it allows us to understand that we all have a unique story to tell. It doesn't matter if you are quote unquote following the same routine from a daily basis, because what's interesting about that is that it is never the same. Your perception of a 9 to 5 and how you get to that particular job and how you get home is entirely different from the day before, and it will be different in the day following that. Traffic, you're traveling by car, bike, bus, modes of transportation, how you wake up in the morning, how much you sleep the day before. Everything is different. And so I think it's really important for me to be able to come to this point where I understand who I am and have come to this understanding that my story is unique, but so is yours. So is everyone that's listening. We're all living this beautiful journey we call life, and we're able to really just embrace it and laugh about the times where we took ourselves so seriously that we thought the world's going to end, and really, yet we're still living the following day.
Right.
So we're able to find joy in moments like that, and you know, that's what I think connects us all. Is how do we look at the circumstances and be able to find the principles? What is the underlying message? What is that seed that has planted that tree?
Mm-hmm. I really think in terms of a universal language. I think of music in that case. And even though it is different around the world, there is definitely that common love for sound and rhythm. And I think one of the reasons it is so universal is that it touches us on the most common human emotions that we experience.
Yeah.
So when we can experience our own pain with somebody else's pain, even though they're completely different, it's all relative. I think that's what connects us in that way. And
Yeah.
potentially that family welcome you into their home with sticky notes all over the house so that you could speak their language. They were understanding their own pain in the context of yours
Yes.
and doing what they could to create a connection so that you wouldn't experience the kind of pain that they knew was likely to happen.
Mm-hmm. And
Just from their own experience.
doing what they could with the best they knew.
Exactly.
I mean,
Exactly.
they didn't have a kid like that before. So I don't think it's not necessarily it's fair or not of me to go back and kind of have a judgment day as far as, oh, why didn't you guys do this differently?
Right.
Because
No.
had they known differently, they would have done differently. And
Right.
they are the type of people that would do that. You know, they're the type of
Mhm.
people that do give 100% at any given time. They genuinely do care about other people. So if they knew of a change that they could have made, I firmly believe that they would have. So
Of course.
for me to go back and I choose to be grateful, not because of the quote unquote second chance that they gave me in life. I choose to be grateful for the people that they chose to show up in my life.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I think we can say that even about the people who didn't treat us well.
Mm-hmm.
I know Shelley and I have had that conversation. Shelley Brown and I have had that conversation about being grateful for those, even the most difficult people in our lives, because they also teach us a lot.
Yeah.
So
Yeah. And
yeah,
sometimes those lessons are unspoken.
well, most of the time I would guess, but it does come back to that whole idea of choosing to grow and learn as opposed to choosing bitterness or regret.
Yes. Yeah.
And it comes full circle back to the beginning of our conversation.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely.
Interesting. So tell me a little bit about the work that you're doing. You were talking about an event that you had in Baltimore where you
Mm-hmm.
got to meet Shelley face to face for the first time.
Mm-hmm.
And you were talking about how that started. And I'd love for you to share that now that I've hit record.
Absolutely. About 2.5 years ago, I had started an organization called Overcoming Odds. And I firmly believe that the organization was born many years before that. But the vision, as far as the official paperwork and government recognition, came true just 2.5 years ago. And so for the longest time, after being adopted especially, I used to ask myself the question of why me? Why was I put along this path? Why was I meant to experience the events that I've had? And what can I learn from each one? And for many, many years following that, I used to think that the answer had to come in this dramatic fashion, that there's going to be a moment where I wake up and have this awakening where I finally know it all, as the movies portray to us. But what I realized was that the answer was always within me. And what I firmly believe that it took in order for me to find that answer was to not only open up to myself enough, but also open up myself to other people and allow other people to become a part of my inner dialogue. Allow other people to ask me questions that I haven't thought of before. Allow other people to show me perspectives of how they've dealt through similar circumstances in their life, so that way I can better understand my own existence. And so what I began to understand was after so many interactions, the realization that I had was, if not me, then who else? Who else was meant to go through what I had to in order to be able to come to this position of being able to help other people along their own journeys? And so when I started to develop this particular organization and this vision, one of the things that I wanted to make sure of, and this could be valuable advice to anyone that's trying to start a business or start a community, is that for a couple ventures before that I was trying to launch at the time, I was taught with this mindset that once you have developed a business concept, you have to go out there and find your first client. You got to paint this persona. You got to know their name, age, what they eat, where they sleep, type of thing. And what I've learned throughout that journey is that why don't I become the first client? Why don't I truly try and understand what is that problem that I'm trying to solve? Because if I try to understand this particular instance through another person's shoes without having experienced it myself, there is going to be a difficult moment. And it happened for me, and it happened many, many times, where I was faced with the question of, do I stay or do I go? Do I continue on with what I started, or do I end it all? Because as people, especially those who are creatives, musicians, artists, entrepreneurs, it is a very difficult road to do so because there's so much unknown that you go through. So when I made the decision to become my business's own client, I also understood the fact that I will not get paid as far as a dollar. But I understood that even though I'm not going to get paid in those terms, I'm going to develop an aspect of myself that money cannot buy. I'm going to develop character. I'm going to find myself along this journey. And I firmly believe that money can't buy that experience that I've had. So when I had that realization, there was a step that I had to take, and it took a lot of courage to be able to step into you and be you and share your story through a public platform, and know that it may attract people who will criticize you for what you shared. Family members, what I've learned along this particular journey, and not all, but some, family members can be your hardest critics.
Yes, I know that.
and when I started this, I shared everything and how everything was born through a 2-page blog post. That's all it was. 2-page blog post of me sharing my whole story of the things that I went through in Russia and when I was adopted, and ultimately what I wanted to create. Within days of publishing that, there were so many people that started to reach out and said, "Me too. I've been there. I know how it feels to be alone, or to feel like no one else understands me along this path." And that's where I had this, speaking of a light bulb moment, where it just clicked for me that it had to be a space for other people as well. That my story is only an entry point for others. I firmly believe that my story is not for me. My story is meant to be shared for other people to see themselves. My story is a reflection of other experiences, of other encounters that I've had in my life. And so when I started to develop this particular platform with that vision in mind, one of the cornerstones that I made sure that we always operate from is that we all have a story, and that every one of the stories is unique, and it needs to be embraced in that way. So one thing led to another, and slowly I began to notice that there had to be another step within this transformational journey that people take on. Sharing your story through an online platform was one thing, and it certainly has helped a lot of people who have reached out and said, "Hey, I've never been a part of this community like this before," or "This truly was a form of therapy for me to be able to reflect." I mean, it's the same concept of journaling.
Right.
And so what I decided to do was, there were 3 or 4 of us at the time, and we looked at about the 70 or 80 stories that were submitted at the time. And we thought to ourselves, how do we take the next step from here? What can we do with the resources that we have at hand to create this additional layer of transformation, of additional layer of change? And that's where we begin with this concept of having in-person events that focus on different elements, different themes of our personal narrative. So whether it be resilience, identity, the event that Shelley Brown and I were a part of was called The Courage to Be You. And it was a really powerful experience because it brings a group of people who have been through tremendous obstacles in life. It also brings people who want to learn more about from individuals like that. And it's a very, words don't even do justice to describe this experience. It's a really unique experience to be a part of, because I firmly believed that this was what was missing for me. When you speak about going into a grocery store, when you speak about going into a Starbucks, where it's such a fast-paced environment, you don't really get many opportunities to share what you're going through. I mean, you order your coffee, and then by the time you walk to the other end of the table, boom, order for Oleg, and then you go.
Mhm.
You don't have a
So
chance to process that.
so the face-to-face was the next step in this
Mm-hmm.
transformation. That was what you really realized you needed to do, was get people face-to-face so that it could solidify what they were already learning about themselves online.
Yeah. Get people face to face and get people into a community, because what I've learned along this journey is that I firmly believe that a lot of the quote unquote problems that we have in today's world are solved through people.
And
It's solved through
community.
connections. It's solved
Yeah,
through community. And
completely
so
agree.
when I understood that, I said, the only thing that makes sense from here is to build a community of other people. And you don't necessarily, I think, need to know the how. You don't need to know what it's going to be. You just need to know where to start. And as you start, and as you align yourself closer to who you are at heart, people begin to appear in your life who are willing to give you assistance and guidance as needed in order to build this into what it needs to be.
I think part of why Shelley wanted us to chat was because I did something similar about 5 years ago, because
Mm-hmm.
March will be the fourth No Longer Virtual conference happening, March 2020 in Chicago. And I'm listening to your story about, it's kind of from that movie, The Field of Dreams. If you build it, they will come.
Yes.
Because it's true. If you are putting out what you know is heartfelt and necessary and needed, if you feel that calling, your community will develop around that calling. And it doesn't necessarily have anything to do with one individual. It's really the calling that brings people together. And so the No Longer Virtual conference was, the first one was in 2017
Mm-hmm.
in Atlanta. And the way that I describe it is that it was self-selected people who wanted to learn and grow together. And it really is, what I love about what you're doing is that it is different in terms of getting people together to share their stories and feel community, build community, and understand how important it is. Because I think we lose so much because we believe our online relationships are enough, and they're not. So I love that you're bringing people together face to face. And you said something early on when we were talking about your soccer experience about the touch and feel.
Mm-hmm.
And it wasn't necessarily the touch and feel of shaking hands or hugging. I mean, that clearly you're on a soccer field, you're 12-year-old boys. None of that was happening. But
No.
there was the physical kick of the ball, the physical feel of his energy being tossed to you across the field. And there is nothing like that energy, whether you're actually touching the person physically. That's not even a huge part of it. It's being in the same room together and feeling that energy. It's the observation of body language and micro expressions that you may not even be consciously observing in the people around you, but subconsciously you're picking up those micro expressions on their faces. And I think people underestimate the importance of that. And it's not just at an event. It's not just
Exactly.
showing up at your event. It's the reminder that when you leave that event, you need to continue sharing that energy, even in Starbucks, for those 30 seconds that you're talking to the person behind the counter.
Mm-hmm. I'm glad that you bring up that point, because it made me think of how we view impact in today's day and age. One of the things that I've faced as far as a series of questions from many, many people who have been donors and supporters and things like of those sorts is that the underlying question has been, well, how many people are you impacting? What are the measurables? What are the things that are happening? And, to a degree, even though I think there's some truth to that, I also say this, that I'm going to continue being me, and I'm going to continue on impacting people through simply the existence and the being of me. And even though I think there's an emphasis on numbers and all these metrics, I think there are also some things that are not measurable with the knowledge that we have now. I can't tell you how energy changes you. We can't measure that. And so the whole concept, and the reason why I bring that up, is because we've had events where I don't think it always has to be with a measurable in order to have an impact.
Mm-hmm.
I think what impact is action. I think no action is too small to create an impact. So the fact that you are putting together events, or you have held virtual meetings where people come together, that's action. That's you choosing to bring people together for common good, for a conversation, for an opportunity for someone else to be heard. And what's really powerful about that experience is that even people who did not speak up during a conversation like that, that doesn't mean that they weren't heard and that they weren't speaking to us.
Right. Or that
Because
they didn't feel the impact. Right?
exactly. For people, sometimes I've been in those situations. I was that ninth grader that sat in the corner of the room of an English class. And whenever our teacher went around the room selecting on different kids to read out loud, I would go like this on the chair,
right.
and hide behind the book.
Shrinking, the incredible shrinking boy.
I would hide behind the book so she wouldn't call on me.
Mm-hmm.
I was that person. And the reason why was because, yes, I didn't have the courage and the confidence within me to be able to stand up. But oh boy, did I rise up when someone else stood in front of that room and read out loud.
So
Because in a way, they were speaking my language. They were speaking what I was telling myself internally as I was reading that book in silence.
Mm-hmm.
So they had an impact on me. And that's what's really important, is that I think sometimes we lose that. We just lose what it means to be human. And we I think, try and label this human experience into one thing. But it's so rich and beautiful. And there's so many different things about what makes us human that just like gives me so much joy. I mean, like you said, I don't have to say a word, but yet I can still be impacted.
Mm-hmm.
And it may take me 20 or 30 years to say that sentence, but that's okay. There's no rush.
Mm-hmm.
I operate according to my own schedule.
I appreciate that reminder that you don't know the impact you have, and it's not always measurable. I would say most of the time, that kind of impact isn't measurable, certainly not in the short term. It could take years. Like you said, it could be 15, 20 years before you actually speak the words that you need to speak. And I think of that in terms of the keynotes and presentations I've given, or the musical performances that I've done, where early on, when I first started professionally singing, I would look out to the audience, and if I saw somebody that was not visibly engaged with the music, I would feel like I had failed in some way. I would look out at the audience and try to engage the audience, and if I would see somebody in the back not dancing or not really paying attention or whatever, I would take it as this personal insult.
Yeah.
It takes a while to get over that. I mean, I still, every once in a while, I'm doing a workshop or a keynote and I have people that are actively disengaged. You're not going to please everybody, but it still starts to grate on me a little. But what I realized early on in my professional singing career was that you don't know what that person is thinking. Just because they're not visibly enthusiastic doesn't mean that they're not internally enthusiastic.
Yeah.
And I found that out slowly but surely over the years when I would actually ask somebody. As a matter of fact, I like to tell this story. I did a keynote that was all about advocacy, and a guy came up to me afterward, and he was one of the people I would look at and not see any expression on his face. Zero. He's a
Huh.
scientist, and
Uh-huh.
no expression on his face throughout my 1 hour keynote. But he came up to me and he said, "That was exactly right. I'm so glad you were here. That's exactly what this group needed to hear. Thank you so much." Really enthusiastic. And this from the guy that wasn't even cracking a smile for the whole hour of my keynote. And he actually showed me his phone. He said, "I just have to show you a message I just sent to a friend." And he showed me his phone, and there's a text message to his friend saying, "Our speaker just brought me to tears." And I'm looking at this guy just thinking, I didn't see any tears. What do you, oh my gosh. And it just proved, it confirmed again that you don't know the impact you're having.
Yeah.
And people demonstrate it in such a variety of ways. Even if you have a negative impact, sometimes it will be years or decades later that potentially negative impact turns somebody else around when they realize that they were wrong.
Yeah. That's, I think, it's an important message to pass on to people, is that even though the impact sometimes can't be measurable, the importance of believing in someone, the importance of believing in other people. I was just having a conversation prior to this call with a friend of mine, and we asked each other, how different would this world have been had we actually encouraged one another to go after our dreams? Think
Mhm.
about those that are in the workplace right now, literally at this particular moment, and are forced with the decision of going into that office and putting in that 2-week resignation. What if the boss or whoever the person that's in charge had received that letter and said, "Hey, I'm here to support you." And
Mhm.
that whole company said, "Hey, we're here to support you." Hell yes, go after those dreams. Achieve what you're going after. But instead, I think it's a slightly different mindset sometimes, as far as, oh, they're trying to prove us wrong, or they're taking a different route. So I'm a huge believer in supporting people at any given moment, and regardless of what the journey, regardless of what it is you're trying to accomplish, and even if I don't know you, I'm here to support you,
Mhm.
because whatever you dream of, I may not experience that dream. And I think there is beauty in seeing someone else's dream come to life, because it gives them that light, and you can
Mhm.
see it. You can see that light just beam through them, where they're
And
finally there.
I totally agree. And the one thing that people forget sometimes is that what their dream is isn't a comparison to yours, and what
Mm-hmm.
their dream isn't a threat to yours.
Mm-hmm.
So just being supportive and being that person, I find that I love being that foundation for somebody. I love, there's something so rewarding about helping somebody get to that point and seeing them shine, even
Yeah.
if I have a little bit of envy, even if I think, oh, when is it going to be my turn? There's still that intrinsic reward, that sense that I helped them accomplish that goal. There's
Yeah.
something beautiful and powerful about that.
And you know, about what's interesting about what you just said is that even though you may have one dream of accomplishing whatever it is that you envision, right?
Hmm.
And let's say in this particular case, hypothetically, you haven't achieved that dream yet, but yet you're able to help me achieve my dream. What it does in turn is that it actually realigns your dream. And I think it helps you find deeper fulfillment, if you
Hmm.
choose to look at it that way, of course. Because for me, there have been many times where I dream of whatever it may be, and I haven't gotten there yet, but I've been able to help someone else get to whatever their dream was. And I can just know that, wow, that fulfillment that I just got, that rush of energy, is actually greater than my initial dream was.
Hmm.
So in a
Well,
way, I've already hit some of those elements.
yeah, and it's interesting because that brings up a Jewish tradition of charity,
Mm-hmm.
that to give to somebody, if you the first level of charity is to give to somebody and you both know who each other is. So for instance, if I give somebody $100
Mm-hmm.
and they know that it's from me and I know it's going to them, that's the first level of charity. The next level of charity is when I give to somebody but they don't necessarily know it's me that's giving it to them, so
Mm-hmm.
kind of an anonymous donation to somebody. And then the highest level of charity, or mitzvah in Hebrew, is to give to somebody and not know who's receiving it and they don't know who's given it.
Mm.
That's the highest level of charity. And when you think about where that comes from, that desire to help without getting any kind of recognition back,
Mm-hmm.
it's so fulfilling. And I think we forget how fulfilling that is because we want that recognition. But then when it
Yeah.
doesn't come, we can internally understand what we've contributed. And I think it's really important to start seeing things in that way in terms of helping others and supporting others in that same way without
Mm-hmm.
expecting anything in return or any recognition.
Mm-hmm. Well, I think it takes a level of courage to be able to step into that space and still know that even though I'm giving towards this thing that is
Mm-hmm.
going to land somewhere, that my experience still matters. And that's, I think, the ultimate question that in my opinion, whenever I choose to give, is the question is, well, how does my experience matter? Do I matter because
Mm-hmm.
I give? And it takes a level where you give just because you want to give. So it boils down to, why are you choosing to give? Are
Mm-hmm.
you choosing to give to kind of validate the fact that you have worked hard and produced X, Y, and Z amount to give in this shape and form? Or are you choosing to give because you genuinely want to help, whatever the cause be, human, animals,
Mm-hmm.
plants, whatever it is that you choose to support? So it's very interesting perspective because it all goes back to you. Why do you choose to do certain things in life, and what is the intention?
Mm-hmm. And it comes right back to that whole speaking the right language, speaking a universal language, full
Yeah.
circle back to the beginning of our conversation, that our stories matter when we're actually, if you think about it in terms of giving, when we share a story that draws out the story and experience of someone else, that's a gift right
Yeah.
there. And I think that's what we both choose to do. And
Mm-hmm.
that's our ultimate goal, is to help people uncover their own stories of relationships, of love, of caring, of pain, so that they can share that universal language of emotion, of human
Mm-hmm.
emotion.
I was going to say what's interesting about what you just said is that even though you and I are or have started these particular platforms in wanting to help other people, what's interesting to note is that at the end of the day, we're still humans.
Mm-hmm.
And it's okay for us and all of the other founders, business owners, community leaders, anyone that's ever listening to the show, to understand that it's okay to process the same range of emotion that other human beings do. The moments of self doubt, the moments where all you want to do is give up, the moments where you keep pushing yourself, the moments where you keep telling yourself that I can get through this, the moments where you choose to pick up the phone and say, hey, I'm going through a difficult time. Can you hear me out? So we've all experienced that. And as part of this journey, what I've begun to understand is that I think it's important to acknowledge that. I think it's important for other people to hear the fact that, yes, we chose to use our own stories and find the courage to step into this field, that we're also human beings and that we also experience this full array of emotions, the days when we're fully excited and the days when we're not so excited.
Mm-hmm.
And so many people, I think what I've learned after connecting with a lot of different community leaders is that I think they need that. We all need
Mm-hmm.
that.
We
I
need to be
on my
given
down
permission. Mm-hmm.
on my down days, I need to hear from a person like you of how you continue to push yourself, how you continue to find hope and inspiration within a day where everything seems to be falling down and all you're doing is putting out fires. And it's encouraging to hear that. And so it just makes me think that at the end of the day, when you speak of that common language, that we're all interconnected somehow, some way. There's something that connects us all. There's something that binds us together. And as long as we continue to believe that, I firmly believe that there's no dialogue that we cannot have in this world.
Totally agree. Excellent. Well, and on that note, it's a perfect opportunity to share with our listeners that there will be a blog post associated with this podcast with some links to learn more about what Oleg is accomplishing with his work over in the Baltimore area and across the country, and actually into Europe a little bit at this point, correct?
Mm-hmm.
And if you'd like to connect with him, there will be a link to his LinkedIn profile. And I would encourage you to reach out to him and ask him questions about his story and find out more about what he's doing. So thank you, Oleg, so much for sharing this time with me. I appreciate it.
No, thank you. And, before we end, one of the things I'd like to mention is I'm extremely grateful for a person like you who chose to step into this space and who chose to use your experience in this way to not only possibly help yourself, but help other people in finding this belonging, finding the fact that they matter, and finding the fact that we're not alone along our journeys. It takes tremendous courage and being able to step into this space and really create this platform. I admire you for that. And I appreciate you for doing the work that you do. It truly is. It's one of those moments where a picture speaks 1,000 words. Your work is that picture.
Thank you. I appreciate that. Thank you for listening to Your Stories Don't Define You, How You Share Them Will. Please visit my website for more podcast episodes, blog posts, and information about how I can help you develop and share your stories at elkinsconsulting.com.
Now listen to me, honey, while I say, how could you tell me that you're going away?